They told me not to wear the uniform. I remember the message clearly, short, sharp, dismissive. It came in the form of a group text the night before the wedding. My mother sent it. Please don't wear your work uniform tomorrow. It'll make guests uncomfortable. Just come as yourself. As yourself, I stared at the screen, trying to decide which version of myself they meant. The one who cleared 4 federal investigations. The one who saved a hostage in that supermarket off I-95. Or maybe the girl they saw when they looked at me, quiet, plain, barely visible behind her older brother's spotlight. I sat in my small apartment, the soft hum of the ceiling fan slicing through silence. My navy dress uniform hung by the window, polished, and pressed, the gold badge gleaming under a shaft of light like it knew it didn't belong in the dark. It wasn't the first time they asked me to dim myself, but this felt different, more final, like they were carving out a permanent role for me in the family, the outsider, the disappointment. Growing up, I was always the quiet one. My brother Mason was the golden child, football captain, valedictorian, the kind who never had to ask for attention. He commanded it. I watched from the sidelines, always the audience, never the act. When I told them at 18 I'd joined the academy, they laughed. Not because they thought I couldn't do it, but because they didn't think it was real. "You a cop?" Mason had snorted. "They letting anyone in these days?" I had passed top of my class. I earned every stripe, every citation, every sleepless night on stakeouts and emergency calls. But they never asked about it. Not once. My life existed outside the family narrative, like a deleted scene no one wanted to watch. And now, at Mason's wedding, they wanted me to come as someone else, as their idea of me. Powerless. Background. I walked into the rehearsal dinner alone the evening before. The venue was a pristine vineyard, all hanging lights and white linens. I had opted for a navy blue suit, formal but neutral. As I approached the table, my mother looked up and offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You made it," she said. "We weren't sure you'd come." I nodded. Neither was I. Mason looked up from his seat at the head table and gave a half-hearted wave. "Hey, Officer Jenny." I hated that nickname, not because of what it implied, but because it reduced my job to a children's cartoon character. It was never said with pride, only condescension. The rest of the evening blurred into polite smiles and clipped conversations. No one asked me where I'd been, what cases I was working. Instead, they asked if I was still doing that police thing. Still. Like it was a phase, like it wasn't 12 years of my life. Back at the hotel, I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself. The real self. The one who could disarm a suspect in seconds, who had been called ma'am by SWAT commanders, who'd written policy briefings used in congressional hearings. The one who could shoot, negotiate, de-escalate, and yet couldn't get her own family to take her seriously. That night, I pulled the uniform from its hanger. I traced the badge with my finger, the embroidered name tag, the stripes on the sleeve. I thought about every moment that led me here. The academy. The nights I cried in my patrol car after losing a civilian. The day I carried a child out of a burning building. The standoff that lasted 14 hours where I talked the man down without firing a shot. I folded it carefully and placed it back in the garment bag. I wasn't going to wear it tomorrow, but not because they told me not to, because they hadn't earned the right to see it yet. They would, though, soon. And not because I needed their approval, but because the truth has a way of showing up even when it's been buried under years of silence. Especially then. The morning of the wedding broke warm and golden, but I felt none of it. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my hotel room, adjusting the collar of a muted dark gray dress. The kind of outfit designed to blend in to disappear. The irony wasn't lost on me. For someone trained to observe and stand out in crisis, I had mastered the art of making myself invisible in rooms filled with people who claimed to love me. The ceremony was set in a historic church, in town-high ceilings, stained glass windows, wooden pews worn by decades of whispered vows. I arrived early, not to help, but to avoid the familiar sideways glances when I entered late. Even now, after all these years, I still sought approval I no longer believed in. Mason stood near the altar, his tuxedo sharp, his smile wider than I'd seen in years. His fiancée, soon-to-be wife, glowed. I barely knew her, though we'd met once or twice. She was kind in the way that rich girls raised in shiny families are kind, polite, distant, and skilled at social choreography. Someone called my name from across the aisle. Aunt Teresa, always loud, always too honest. "Jenny, come help with the parking. Will you? The valet's running late." I blinked. I'm not with the staff." "Oh, I know," she said, flapping her hand. "But you're good at this sort of thing. Just for a bit until they sort it out." I hesitated. Around me, the early guests were beginning to stream in. No one else moved. I glanced at my mother, who stood by the entryway giving last-minute directions. Her eyes met mine, and she nodded, not in thanks, but expectation. There it was again. That silent agreement that I'd do what needed to be done, not because they asked, but because I was the one who didn't matter. So I went. Outside, the sun beat down on the gravel driveway. Cars rolled in, one after another, sleek black sedans, polished SUVs, the kind of vehicles that belong to lawyers, surgeons, bankers. Guests handed me keys without a second look. One even pressed a $5 bill into my palm, murmuring, "Thanks, buddy," as if I weren't wearing a dress and heels. I parked cars for almost 30 minutes. Not once did anyone ask who I was. Not once did anyone recognize me. By the time the ceremony was about to begin, the real valet had arrived. I passed him the last set of keys, brushed off my dress, and returned to the entrance just in time to see the bridal procession lining up. I tried to slip in quietly, but my sister-in-law's mother stepped in front of me. "Family's seated up front," she said. "But you might be more comfortable in the back. There's standing room." It wasn't a suggestion. It never was. I nodded. "Sure." As I stood at the back of the chapel behind the last pew, I felt the weight of every moment I'd been invisible in this family, every holiday spent working, while Mason gave toasts, every medal tucked away, because no one asked. My fingers grazed the phone in my clutch. One unread message blinked at the top. "Commander, your presence is requested at 1600 hours. A routine check-in. I had replied confirmed earlier that morning. Commander? That word still startled me sometimes. Outside this family, it meant something. Inside, it was a lie they refused to believe. A fantasy they mocked. I watched the ceremony unfold in slow motion. Mason beamed. My mother dabbed her eyes. The pastor spoke of honor, strength, commitment. I stared ahead, dry-eyed, unmoved. And yet somewhere deep, I didn't feel anger. Not yet. Just something colder. A kind of sadness so sharp, it cut through every uniform I'd ever worn, every title I'd ever earned. They didn't know who I was, but they would. And when they did, it wouldn't be through words or arguments or desperate attempts to prove myself. It would be with one single gesture, one moment, one man. And when it happened, it would change everything. The reception was set in an elegant courtyard behind the chapel. White tablecloths shimmered under string lights, and waiters floated between guests carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. I arrived a few minutes late, having taken a moment to clean the dust off my heels and recompose my expression. On the outside, I was calm, a silent shadow moving between the golden lights and murmured laughter. On the inside, I was unraveling thread by thread. They had assigned me a seat at the far edge of the tent near the kitchen entrance. Table 17. I was between Cousin Jeremy, who spent most of the night scrolling through his phone, and an empty chair left for someone who never arrived. I sipped water, chewed on a flavorless bread roll, and tried not to look like I cared. The microphone crackled, and Mason stood up. He was already tipsy, that particular looseness in his jaw, the way his words slurred just slightly. "Tonight's not just about me and Emily," he said, voice booming. "It's about family, about support, about those who lift you up when you fall." I raised an eyebrow. "Support," he continued, lifting his glass. "To my parents who taught me strength, to my friends who stood by me, and to my sister Well, wherever she is, probably arresting someone. The room laughed. I didn't. I stared at my untouched plate and forced myself to stay seated. He wasn't done. She always did like to play dress-up, he said. Even when we were kids, she'd run around in Dad's old jacket pretending she was a detective. I guess some people never grow out of pretending. That was it. The last string snapped. I stood. Silently, I walked away from the table, past the champagne flutes, and clinking forks past the smiling faces, and whispered gossip. No one stopped me. No one asked if I was okay. Outside, the air was cooler. A soft breeze lifted the edge of my dress as I stepped into the garden. I could hear the muffled music begin behind me, the first ants no doubt starting their song, their spotlight. I stood by the edge of the lawn, looking out into the trees. I could have left. I should have. But something held me there. A shift in the wind. Or maybe fate. A voice behind me broke the quiet. "Ma'am!" I turned. He wore a black dress uniform, polished boots, sharp silver pins, formal law enforcement attire. I recognized the insignia instantly. My spine straightened before my mind caught up. "Chief Delgado," I said. He nodded. "Commander Grant." And just like that, the title returned. The world I'd tried to suppress for their sake stepped fully into view. "I didn't know you'd be here," I said quietly. He offered a small smile. "Didn't plan to, but I had business nearby and your supervisor mentioned where you'd be. Thought I'd stop by. Protocol says I should salute a superior officer when I see one." My stomach twisted. "Please don't do that, not here." But it was too late. He stepped forward, straightened, raised his right hand in sharp, precise motion. A full salute. I felt the shift before I saw it. Gasps behind me. Movement. Whispers. I turned. They were all there. My mother, frozen mid-bite, Mason, with his champagne glass half raised. Emily, blinking in confusion. The entire wedding party stared across the lawn as Chief Delgado, one of the most decorated officers in the state, stood at rigid attention before me. He held the salute. And I nodded once. He dropped his hand, then said clearly, "We're grateful for your service, Commander." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the trees like a specter called by truth itself. I stood motionless. Then slowly, I turned back toward the reception. The music had stopped. Silence stretched awkward and heavy. And in that moment, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel ashamed. I felt seen, truly seen, not because I demanded it, not because I shouted, but because the truth stood in full uniform and spoke louder than any lie ever could. My mother rose from her seat, lips, parted confusion etched across her face. Mason's expression was unreadable. I walked past them, shoulders square, heart pounding not with rage, but with something older and deeper, dignity, and a quiet knowing. The curtain had lifted. The act was over, and the real show was just beginning. I didn't return to my seat. Instead, I kept walking past the gaping mouths, the stilled forks, the stunned eyes of people who had spent a lifetime pretending I was something I wasn't. I reached the edge of the tent and slipped into the hallway that led to the venue's side exit. My breath came steady, but my chest felt like it held 1,000 storms. I didn't know whether I wanted to scream or laugh. I paused by the mirror in the hallway. There I was, not the girl they remembered. Not the Officer Jenny of their mockery. Not the one seated near the kitchen doors. No. In that moment, I looked like something entirely different. Someone who didn't need to be invited to the front row to matter. Someone whose worth didn't depend on recognition and yet had just been recognized in the most undeniable way. A knock sounded on the door to the hallway. Then it opened and Mason stepped in. He shut the door behind him, slowly, hands in his pockets. That was something. I said nothing. He shifted uncomfortably. "So it's true." I turned to him. "What part?" "That you're really some kind of commander." I let out a dry laugh. "Some kind of..." He leaned against the wall, brow furrowed. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I looked at him flatly. "Because no one ever asked." He flinched at that, just slightly, but it was enough. For a moment, silence hung between us, not the kind that begged to be filled, but the kind that held weight, memory, grief. I didn't mean what I said, he offered after a long pause. At dinner. I nodded. But you said it anyway. I thought you were just doing desk work somewhere, he said, voice quieter now. I didn't know it was serious. I stepped closer. You didn't want to know. That's the difference. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I sighed. Do you remember the night I left for the academy? He blinked. What? I came to say goodbye. You were having a party. You told me not to embarrass you. He swallowed. I spent the first week at the academy thinking maybe I made a mistake, I said. But then I realized something. I didn't want to become someone for this family to accept. I wanted to become someone I could respect. He looked down at the floor. So what now? I tilted my head. What now? You go back out there and cut the cake. I go home. You're leaving. I nodded. There's nothing left for me here. You didn't even dance, he tried, half a joke. I don't dance for people who don't see me. He winced. I reached for the doorknob, then paused. You know, I said I always thought you were lucky. To be the favorite, to be loved so easily. Mason looked up startled. But now I realize I'm the lucky one. I had to earn everything. Fight for every inch of space. And because of that, I know who I am. With that, I walked away, out into the night. The air had cooled, and a breeze swept through the trees like applause from the universe. I didn't need closure. I didn't need an apology. Because the most powerful revenge isn't cruelty or punishment, it's living in truth. It's walking into a room full of people who doubted you and letting your presence speak for itself. And that night under the stars, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom, not from them, but from the need to be seen by people who never looked in the first place. I didn't drive straight home. Instead, I took the long way, a winding road through the outskirts of town, past empty fields and quiet gas stations, the kind of landscape that used to make me feel small. But not tonight. Tonight, the silence felt like a companion. I rolled down the window, let the wind pull at my hair, and breathed in the night like it was the first time I'd remembered how. The chief had sent a text while I was driving. Didn't mean to stir anything, but they needed to know. I smiled at that. He hadn't stirred anything. He'd merely turned on a light. The shadows had always been there, the shape of my family's dismissiveness, the outline of their discomfort with my strength, their fear that I had become more than the role they carved for me. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light was already on. I lived alone, always had. There was something calming about stepping into a space that reflected only you. No expectations, no comparisons, just silence and strength. Inside, I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window. A bird chirped once in the distance, then silence again. I let it wrap around me like armor. I didn't sleep that night. My mind replayed the day not with bitterness, but curiosity. I examined every glance, every word. The looks from my mother, the way Mason had followed me, even the staff who looked at me differently after the chief's salute. Power is strange. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it shows up in silence, in the way a room tilts toward you when the truth finally drops. The next morning, I got a call. Not from family, from HQ. Ma'am, request your presence. Situation escalating. Classified briefing, 1300 hours. Back to work. Back to the other world, the one where I was respected not because of bloodlines, but because I earned it every damn day. I drove into the city past rows of gray buildings and uniformed officers standing at attention as I passed. At the gates, the guard snapped to a salute before waving me through. My badge scanned clean. My ID read, Commander Jennifer Grant. Inside the conference room, the lights were dim, the screen glowing with classified intel. A task force lead handed me a folder. He didn't say, "Are you sure you're qualified?" He said, "We need your judgment." I scanned the pages, eyes narrowing. Drug pipeline, corrupt city officials, possible internal breach, standard chaos. I nodded. I'll take lead. He didn't question it. And I remembered then out there, I might have been the weird sister or the fake cop. But in here, I was something else entirely. Essential. Later that afternoon, after the meeting, I checked my phone again. 3 missed calls from Mason, 2 from my mother, and 1 voicemail. I didn't listen. Not yet. Instead, I walked to the observation deck on the top floor. The city stretched out beneath me, glass and steel and movement. I thought about all the people who had doubted me over the years. The teachers who told me to smile more, the relatives who asked if I was dating anyone instead of asking about my work, the men who called me intense or too much and then asked for help when things got real. I had been too much, it seemed too smart, too driven, too unwilling to shrink. And now I was exactly enough. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to explain myself. I just existed, and that was more than enough. As I turned to leave the deck, my phone buzzed again. A text from Mason. I didn't know how to see you until last night. I'm sorry, really. I'm proud of you. Can we talk? I read the message twice. Then again, I didn't reply. Not out of anger. I wasn't angry anymore. But because finally, I didn't need to hear it. My story wasn't about being acknowledged. It was about becoming someone who didn't require it. And I already had. 2 weeks passed before I saw them again. It wasn't planned. I had no intention of returning to the familiar spaces they inhabited, the well-practiced routines of judgment wrapped in polite smiles. But the city held its own sense of irony. One moment, I was reviewing field briefings in the operations center, and the next I was called to a civilian security summit, an annual coordination event between city departments, law enforcement, and civilian representatives. And Mason was there. Not as a groom, not as a brother, but as a speaker. He had recently joined a civic outreach program, something about building bridges between law enforcement and local communities. Ironic, considering the wall he'd once built between us. When I entered the building, I wore my standard issue uniform, not dress whites, but sharp and authoritative nonetheless. My hair was tied back, my expression neutral. I was not there to prove anything. I was there to do my job. He saw me before I saw him. His face shifted not in fear, but something close to reverence. He approached slowly, like someone not sure if the door would still open if they knocked. "Commander," he said softly. I nodded once. "Mason." He scratched the back of his neck. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I was assigned," I replied. "I don't choose who needs protection." He winced at the unintended edge in my tone. "I meant what I texted," he said, lowering his voice. "About being proud. About being sorry." "I know," I said. "I read it. I meant to call. I didn't need you to." Silence again. The kind we had become fluent in. He tried a different route. "Mom's been asking about you." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that supposed to be comforting?" He exhaled. "No. Just, I think she understands now. At least a little." I turned my gaze to the room beyond. City officials, department heads, and policy advisors milled about in circles of small talk. I was not one of them. I never had been. But I was always needed when the conversation turned to action. "You don't need to explain them to me," I said. "I've spent a lifetime trying to understand them. That's your burden now." He swallowed hard. "That's fair." The meeting began. I took my place on the security panel flanked by senior officers and state analysts. We discussed crime prevention, emergency protocols, response times. I spoke only when necessary, direct, measured, precise. I could feel Mason watching, though he sat 3 rows back. Afterward, I exited to the hallway expecting a clear path to the parking lot. But instead, I found my mother there, waiting. Dressed in navy blue, her hair pinned tight, posture straight like she was preparing for battle. "Jennifer," she said. I stood still. "You look," she faltered. "Different." I said nothing. "I watched the summit online. You spoke so clearly. You were impressive." I gave a slight nod. "It's what I do." She fumbled with her purse strap. "I didn't know all those years. I thought you were just playing at something, pretending." "I wasn't." "I know that now." Her voice cracked. I had imagined this moment before dozens of times. The apology, the recognition, the tearful acknowledgement of all that had been unseen. But standing there face to face, I felt no surge of vindication, no thrill of triumph. Only calm, only peace. I spent years trying to make you proud, I said softly. And then I realized I didn't have to. She blinked back tears. I became who I am without your applause, I continued, and that's what makes it real. She stepped forward, arms slightly lifted, unsure whether she was asking for an embrace or forgiveness. I didn't move, not because I hated her, but because I had finally stopped needing her to understand what she had never tried to. I gave her a nod. That was all. Then I turned and walked down the corridor, each step echoing like punctuation. That was the difference now. They didn't define the room. I did. And my silence, sharpened by years of exclusion, now held the kind of gravity that could not be ignored. Not by family, not by peers, not by anyone. Back at headquarters, things moved faster than usual. A major operation had been greenlit, multi-jurisdictional, high stakes, and tightly sealed. I was selected to lead a covert unit for the takedown of a cartel-aligned security network operating under the guise of a logistics firm. The mission would span several states and require weeks of planning. The timing felt poetic. While my family processed the version of me they'd never believed in, I was being trusted with one of the most critical operations of the quarter. It wasn't about glory. It was about trust, about capability, about the quiet kind of respect that doesn't need applause. It shows itself in the missions they give you when everything is on the line. I briefed my team that morning. No one questioned me. No one doubted. I had earned that. One of the rookies, Reyes, lingered after the meeting. "Ma'am," she said, voice soft. "Can I ask something?" I turned to her. "How do you stay so composed when people underestimate you?" I considered it for a long moment. She reminded me of myself years ago. Quiet, sharp, hungry to be seen, but unsure how. I answered slowly. "You learn to let silence work for you. You let your work speak until your words become unnecessary." She nodded, wide-eyed. "And one day I added the people who doubted you will either fall silent or applaud." We deployed 2 days later. I led the intel brief, coordinated comms, and sat through 14 hours of negotiation with federal agents. Each moment brought back years of effort, every academy exam, every mission in bad weather, every room I was underestimated in. None of it had been for nothing. The takedown went clean. No casualties, 24 arrests, national coverage. And at the press conference the next day, they asked for me by name. The mayor thanked me personally. The department released a statement calling me instrumental. But the moment that lingered didn't happen at the podium. It happened when I stepped out back for air. Standing there leaning on the barricade was my father. I hadn't seen him in nearly a year. After the wedding, he hadn't called, hadn't written. Not even when Mason told him what had happened. He looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow. He didn't say anything right away, just took off his cap and held it in his hands. "I saw the press conference," he said finally. I gave a slow nod, figured someone would. He hesitated. "I didn't know how to face you." I met his eyes. "Then why now?" "Because," he said, voice rough, "I can't pretend anymore. Not after seeing what you've done, what you are." I waited. "I used to think you were trying to prove something," he continued. "Now I realize you were just doing what none of us had the courage to." My chest tightened. It wasn't validation I needed, but it was honesty I hadn't expected. He reached into his coat and handed me something small, a photo. Me in uniform on the front page of a national paper. "I kept this," he said. I looked down at the image. The same face that once looked out from the back row of family photos. The same eyes, but different now. Hardened. Clear. "Thank you," I said, tucking the photo into my pocket. He nodded. "I'll let you get back to it." As he walked away, I didn't stop him. Because I had nothing left to prove. I had done more than they ever expected, and I'd done it without their permission. And that in itself was the story. Not vengeance, not validation, but quiet, unwavering worth, forged in silence, delivered in strength. The following month, I was invited to attend the National Security Symposium in D.C., a high-level gathering of military officers, intelligence directors, and law enforcement strategists. It was the kind of event that used to feel galaxies away from the girl my parents once called too emotional to lead. But now it felt like the natural next step. I wasn't attending as an observer. I was one of the keynote speakers. My name appeared on the program between a retired 4-star general and the deputy director of the FBI. I was scheduled to speak on silent command leadership without applause. The irony didn't escape me. The night before my flight, I received an email from the symposium committee they'd be broadcasting the event live across multiple national channels. I exhaled slowly. Exposure had never been my goal. But truthfully, I didn't mind anymore. I had stopped hiding. I had stepped fully into who I was, whether they watched or not. On the flight, I kept my notes closed. I didn't rehearse. I let the silence of 30,000 feet fill me with steadiness. I looked out the window and watched the clouds drift beneath me like oceans of quiet, exactly how I'd survived all these years. Quiet, steady, rising. The hotel in D.C. was all marble and crystal chandeliers. I checked in alone. I ate dinner alone. I walked the halls lined with national flags and portraits of men who had shaped policy and war and peace. And I thought they all had mothers too. Fathers, brothers, people who once didn't see them clearly. Maybe we all start in the shadows. The morning of the speech, I dressed in full formal uniform, black and navy, with a silver bar clipped at the collar. My ribbons were understated but heavy with meaning. The weight didn't burden me. It steadied me. When I walked on stage, the crowd stood, not out of ceremony, out of respect. It caught me off guard briefly. I paused behind the podium and let the sound of applause wash over me. Not because I needed it, but because it reminded me of every room I'd been ignored in. And now, I was here, I began. I wasn't supposed to lead. That first line was like an opening door. I told them the truth, not the classified briefings or statistics. The truth of what it feels like to lead when you're not invited. To carry weight in silence. To command without ever raising your voice. I spoke for 15 minutes, not a second more. When I ended, there was another standing ovation. I stepped off stage, walked through the side hall, and out to the atrium. And there she was, my sister, Lydia. She hadn't called in months, hadn't reached out since the wedding. She looked smaller now, not physically, but emotionally, like life had worn down the pride she wore like armor. "You were incredible," she said. I studied her for a long moment. "I watched it all," she added, "from the beginning, even the moments I wasn't supposed to see. I've been following everything you've done." "I know," I said quietly. She fumbled. I don't know how we let it get so far." "We didn't let it," I said. "You just never noticed when I left." She nodded, tears pooling. "I was jealous," she admitted. "All these years, I thought I had the spotlight, but you had something stronger." "What's that?" "Purpose," I didn't respond, because she was right. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain it. We sat together in silence for a few minutes, not mending what had broken, but acknowledging it. And that in itself was something. When I left the symposium that evening, the sky had just turned gold, the kind of light that makes everything look soft and important. I didn't know what would come next. I just knew I was finally writing the story myself. By the time I returned to my city, everything had changed, not in the streets or in the headlines, but in me. I no longer walked with the quiet hesitation of someone trying to be seen. I no longer feared being misunderstood. I had been heard, and more importantly, I had learned to speak for myself, whether anyone listened or not. When I walked into the precinct that Monday morning, something shifted. The younger officers stood a little straighter. The chief gave me a nod that held more weight than words ever could. And on my desk sat a handwritten note from the mayor. "We don't say it enough, but you've reshaped how this city sees leadership. Thank you for standing tall in silence and in storms." I tucked it into the drawer with a quiet smile. That same week, I was notified of my nomination for National Commendation, a rare honor. But I didn't tell my family. I wasn't sure they'd understand what it truly meant. Instead, I focused on my work. Every day, I led morning briefings with my unit, mentored the new recruits, and coordinated a citywide task force that would have been unimaginable for me to lead just a year prior. My team respected me not because of the title, but because they had seen me in the field, in the trenches, in the moments that tested our very humanity. And then came the unexpected. A call from Mason. "Hey," he said, voice warm. "So, Lydia's organizing a small family dinner this weekend. Just a few people. No pressure. She asked if I'd invite you." I paused. My silence stretched long enough that he added quickly, "You don't have to come. I just thought you should know she's trying. We all are." I didn't answer right away. After everything, part of me wanted to decline, to stay in my own peace. But something deeper, not forgiveness, but a sense of calm completion nudged me forward. "All right," I said. "I'll come." Saturday arrived, and I stood outside Lydia's house, the same house that had once hosted that unforgettable wedding. But this time, the air didn't sting. It felt neutral. Still. When I stepped inside, the room quieted. All eyes turned, not in judgment, not in disbelief, but in recognition. Mason approached with a half smile. "Glad you came." Lydia looked different. Softer, maybe. She greeted me with genuine warmth, her eyes searching for signs of resentment. I gave her none. I had released it all long ago. Dinner was surprisingly pleasant. Conversation flowed. Old wounds were avoided, and new ground was gently, tentatively explored. At one point, my father raised a toast. To second chances, he said, "Eyes on me." And to the kind of strength that doesn't ask for attention, but commands it anyway. The clink of glasses echoed in a quiet kind of reverence. After dinner, I stepped out onto the porch alone, letting the night air wrap around me. The city lights flickered in the distance, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I existed on the edge of my own story. I was in it, fully. Suddenly, Mason appeared beside me. He handed me a small wrapped box. "Open it." Inside was a nameplate, black and silver, engraved with my full title. "Commander Jennifer Blake? Got it made after I saw your speech," he said. "Figured you should have something that says it, even if you already live it." I swallowed hard. "Thank you," I whispered. We stood there a moment longer, siblings again, perhaps for the first time. And as I looked out at the skyline, I realized something. The uniform, the rank, the accolades, they weren't the revenge. The revenge was becoming everything they said I'd never be. Quietly, steadily, unapologetically. And now I didn't need to speak to be seen. I had become the silence that made the whole room listen. Months passed. Life didn't slow down. If anything, it accelerated. My position as commander came with responsibilities. I once only dreamed of managing interagency operations, leading critical briefings with federal counterparts, and shaping policies that would impact the next generation of officers. But amid the growing recognition, I stayed grounded. I still walked the precinct floors. I still answered calls when I didn't have to. I still listened because I had once known what it felt like to be unheard. Recognition came in waves, interviews, awards, keynote invitations. The media branded me the silent commander. It was meant to sound mysterious, maybe even dramatic, but I wore it with quiet pride. Silence had been my greatest weapon. And now, it was my legacy. One evening, as I prepared for a citywide ceremony honoring public service, I found myself alone in my office. I looked around at the walls, photographs, commendations, framed letters of thanks. They were symbols. Not of victory over my family, but of victory over doubt. My own. There was a soft knock. Mason stepped in dressed in a simple suit. He looked around the room, then at me. "Big night," he said. "Feels like any other," I replied. He smiled. "You've always been like this, calm in the storm." "You just never noticed before." He nodded sheepishly. "That's true." He handed me a letter. "Dad wrote this before he passed." I took it, startled. My father had passed quietly a few weeks earlier. I hadn't expected much closure, but now I held it in my hands. I unfolded the note written in uneven fading script. "Jennifer, I never knew how to say this to your face, but I need you to know I was wrong. About everything. About what strength looks like. About what success really means. I see now that you were never trying to impress us. You were just being exactly who you are, and it was more than enough. I'm proud of you. Always have been. I just didn't know how to show it. Forgive me." The paper trembled slightly in my hands. I didn't cry. I didn't crumble. I simply closed my eyes and let the silence fill the room again, not as a void, but as completion. That night, when I stood before the city, dressed in full ceremonial uniform, under the grand lights of the hall, the crowd once again rose. But I didn't need their applause, because I remembered the girl standing alone in the backyard of her brother's wedding. I remembered the sting of dismissal, the ache of invisibility, and I remembered the choice I made in that moment to rise anyway. I stepped up to the microphone, looked out across the sea of faces, and spoke with quiet conviction. I was never supposed to lead. I wasn't chosen. I wasn't praised. I wasn't protected. But I became the person I needed. And now I lead not to be seen, but to remind others that silence isn't weakness. It's power, if you carry it well. The room held its breath. And in that pause, in that perfect stillness, I knew this wasn't a revenge story. This was a resurrection. Of identity, of dignity, of everything they tried to bury in me, and everything I chose to unearth on my own. And so I smiled not for them but for me, because the girl in the fake uniform was gone, and in her place stood a commander.